Okay, thank you for the introduction, Florian. So this talk is about proofs of space, also about proofs of replication, but specifically about tight proofs of space, which will become apparent in the talk what that means. So first, let's start with what is a proof of space? Well, a proof of space is an alternative to proof of work, and applications have been proposed similar to the applications of proof of work for spam prevention, DOS attack prevention, or simple resistance and consensus networks, which is most relevant to this conference. And what is the basics of a proof of space? Well, you can think of it as an interactive protocol between, say, a miner or a prover who has some disk storage and claims that, hey, I am storing 1 gigabyte of data, just arbitrary data. And then there's an interactive protocol where the prover sends some kind of ID that represents this particular proof, some kind of commitment message, gets a challenge from the verifier, and then sends back a proof, and the verifier verifies the proof and should be convinced that indeed the prover is storing at least 1 gigabyte of data. Now, importantly, the proof for this to be an interesting type of protocol should be very small compared to the size of the data. Now, as is common in interactive protocols like this, we can make the protocol non-interactive using a standard trick in cryptography called the Fiat-Shamir transform, where instead of having a completely interactive protocol, the prover first chooses the ID and the commitment, and then basically generates the random challenge as a hash of the first message, and then sends a proof, which the verifier should be convinced of, and then concludes that at least at this particular moment in time, the prover must have been storing or using that much data, that much storage, say 1 gigabyte of storage, in order to produce a successful proof. But then we could also talk about a proof of persistent space, where you kind of move this interactive protocol or non-interactive protocol into an initialization phase, where the prover initializes its storage, fills up its drive with 1 gigabyte of data, and says, "Hey, I'm storing a lot of data on my disk," and then send a commitment to that, and then later, during a repetitive online phase, receive challenges from the verifier, and if the prover passes, then it indicates that the prover is still storing that same 1 gigabyte of data. And the reason why we split it up like this is because the initialization phase is a relatively expensive operation, whereas the online challenges become very cheap to just check that the prover is still storing the same data. Now, in order to have a meaningful notion of security here, the online phase actually needs to require some kind of notion of a time limit or a time-limited response. Otherwise, the prover can start over from scratch and generate everything from the beginning. So the idea is that if the prover deletes its data, then it will not be able to regenerate the same proof within the allotted time. Or alternatively, you can think of it as the prover will have to, and some constructions do not have this sequential time property, but the prover will have to expend a large amount of computational work in order to pass the online challenge if it's not storing the data, which incurs some kind of time-space trade-off. And I'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about what it means for a proof of space to be secure. So first and formally, how tight is a proof of space? What do I mean by tight? Well, how much space can an adversarial prover save and still pass the protocol, right? Can the adversarial prover, say, pass with only 1 minus epsilon gigabyte of data? And the answer should be no for epsilon, or 1 minus epsilon, as close to 1 as possible, and closer to 1 would be tighter. It should be able to save as little data as possible. So in terms of defining security for a proof of space, the strongest notion would be this parallel security, which says that, so the proof of space is epsilon tight if any online prover who stores less than 1 minus epsilon gigabytes in this interactive protocol will fail to respond within the time limit t, except with negligible probability. And typically we need t to be large, so t would be proportional to the storage size. And the tighter the proof is, well, that would mean that 1 minus epsilon is as close to 1 as possible. A weaker notion, which I just mentioned, was a time-space trade-off. And let's say this proof of space is not parallel secure, so it means that the online prover could actually pass within the allotted time the protocol while storing less than 1 minus epsilon gigabytes of data, but then the prover would have to still do a very large amount of work proportional to the storage size. So that's a weaker notion. And a weaker, even weaker notion yet would be a time-space trade-off where there isn't this kind of threshold where if the prover has to do a tremendous amount of work if it stores even less than 1 minus epsilon times the data, but rather that there's some kind of equation that gives a time-space trade-off where the required persistent storage would be something like, if S is the total storage and T is the total work, then you have S to the K times T would be greater than 1 minus epsilon N to the K. And this last notion of security can never be too tight, because you could set S to be less than 1 minus epsilon N, and T would still be kind of constant. So what would I call a, quote, tight proof of space? Well, one that's arbitrarily tight, meaning that I can tune the protocol parameters for any given constant epsilon less than 1 so that it is an epsilon type proof of space. Meaning I can tune the parameters of the protocol so that, you know, if I want to make sure the adversary can't even save a 1% of the data or a 0.01% of the data, I can tune the protocol parameters so that that's the case. And when I tune the protocol parameters in this way, I want to make sure that I'm not compromising on efficiency. So a tight proof of space construction would maintain efficiency even as epsilon is made arbitrarily small. And ideally proportional to 1 over epsilon, which is kind of the best you can do. If you make epsilon smaller, you do have to increase the communication or the proof size. But the best that you can get is proportional to 1 over epsilon. And that's actually what this work achieves. It achieves tight proofs of space that are the ideal tight proof of space. So before this work, what was sort of the scope of proofs of space? Well, there were no provably tight proofs of space. So the original proof of space was proposed in 2015, and that had a 1 minus epsilon of less than 1 over 512. Again, heuristically, maybe the protocol was more secure, but this is just in terms of what we could prove about the protocol. And we can't prove that the adversary is not storing more than a 1 over 512 fraction of the data. So it could save a lot of data. It's saving, it's only storing 1 over 512 gigabytes in that previous example. Then Ren and Devadis for 2016 moved this closer to 1. And in their protocol, you can only prove that that 1 minus epsilon is less than 1/2. And that's like a theoretical upper bound, but even the protocol becomes impractical at 1 minus epsilon is equal to 1/3, meaning that you cannot really practically have practical parameters and then prove that the adversary is storing more than 1/3 of the data. And then 2017, every year things get slightly different, but so this is actually the proof of space that Chia is using, and that has improvements in other regards, but it's even worse in terms of how tight it is. It uses the weakest notion of proof of space, which has the time-space trade-off, and theoretically it cannot be a tight proof of space. 1 minus epsilon has to be even less than like 1 over log n asymptotically. And then PHSAC from just this past year had sort of the first tight proof of space, which I would call quasi-tight because the proof size increases proportional to 1 over epsilon squared, which makes makes the parameters or the proof size blow up quite significantly as epsilon becomes small. And moreover, well, I mean, this is, so from a theoretical perspective, it is tight, just not, it doesn't maintain efficiency proportional to 1 over epsilon, which is the ideal. But second, we don't really have any practical instantiation of that construction since it requires a very, very special type of depth robust graph. And I'll talk about what depth robust graphs are later since this work uses them as well. But it requires a very special type of DRG that we don't really have practical instantiations of even heuristically or experimentally. So why does tight proof of space matter? Well, first of all, we get better provable security for proof of space, and if we're, say, basing, blockchain systems or, any kind of Sybil resistance mechanism on proof of space, you want it to be provably tight. You want to know that the bounds are really tight on how much space the prover is actually using. There isn't a large difference between different adversaries with different strategies. But another reason, and sort of the motivation for this work, was that it's actually necessary for this other thing called proof of replication. And proof of replication, you can think of it as a useful proof of space. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that instead of just storing a lot of data, the prover, or say the miner, is encoding a movie on its disk, a specific movie that, say, a client would be interested in. You're saying, I'm storing the Lord of the Rings HD on my 10 gigabyte hard drive. And then they go through the dance of the protocol, and there's a challenge and a proof. Just the exact same characteristics of a proof of space, yet the verifier is convinced somehow that the prover is storing not only a lot of data, but like a specific piece of interesting data. Well, it turns out, though, that you can't really achieve this perfectly cryptographically, and the best possible security that you can achieve for this is some notion of rational security, and what I call epsilon rational security, which means that the adversary cannot save more than an epsilon fraction by not replicating the specific movie. In other words, the miner is saying, well, gee, I can't save more than just an epsilon gigabyte by not storing the Lord of the Rings, so I might as well store the Lord of the Rings. Now, you may notice a connection to tight proof of space. If something is epsilon rational secure, it means that you can't even save even an epsilon amount of storage, which means that the proof of space, or the proof of replication as the proof of space, is tight, right, for a small epsilon. And in fact, these notions are kind of equivalent. So in order to construct this proof of replication protocol that's epsilon rational secure, you need a tight proof of space, and in fact, if you have a construction of tight proofs of space, you can use that to construct an epsilon rational secure proof of replication. So they're equivalent notions. However, they're equivalent notions from the perspective of security. There's an extra consideration you might want when you're talking about doing a proof of replication as opposed to a proof of space, which is, well, this is interesting data I might want to actually extract. So, well, the verifier says, I'm tired just verifying proofs. I want my darn movie, right? So, okay, just wait for me to extract it from my POREP encoding. And then after some time, the prover will be able to actually extract the movie and send it to the verifier. Because the prover's not actually storing the movie, it's storing some kind of fancy encoding of the movie that allows it to do this proof. So a POREP with inefficient extraction can be built from any type proof of space, as I mentioned, but a POREP with efficient extraction is harder. Now, one more thing, a POREP with efficient extraction is kind of a double-edged sword, because efficient extraction also means that the proof of replication is not asynchronously composable. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, well, let me illustrate to you what a sort of attack is. Well, if the prover is kind of producing different proofs over time for independent movies and claiming to use storage to store both of these movies, then if the verifier is not privy to the actual movie that's the prover is storing and is just verifying proofs of space, then what the prover can do is basically generate the encoding of the first file and then use the output of that as sort of the input to the next proof of space. And by this property of efficient extraction, the prover only needs to store the data that it's using for the second proof of replication and can efficiently extract from it the data that it needs to pass the first proof of replication protocol. So it kind of stores only half the data. This is prevented by focusing just on protocols where the prover commits to the total amount of storage or total amount of files that it's going to store at one period of time, and then the security would hold, right? So the way that you could use this in a system if you want efficient data extraction is to make the prover commit to all the movies that it wants to store at one instant in time, and then have to sort of every, say, epoch or period, make them, reinitialize all the movies that they want to store at any given point in time, and then challenge them on those. If you allow the prover to lazily claim or add committed movies over time, then you can't have both security and efficient extraction, which has serious practical implications. All right, so let's skip over to how we actually construct these things. And what I'll start with is sort of a basic technique that is sort of the basis of most proof of space constructions. When I mentioned that you're storing basically some kind of specially encoded data, well, the way that this is done in proofs of space is by basically labeling the nodes of a graph, okay? And so say every label is like a 32-byte label, so you have, let's say you have n labels overall for the total amount of storage of 32n bytes, then you're going to derive some kind of special label on every single node of the graph. And how do we label the graph? Well, specifically, it's going to be a directed acyclic graph. And what we're going to use for the labeling is a collision-resistant hash function that's going to be salted by the ID for the proof, so that if you wanted to do this for two different proofs, they would be completely independent. So let me walk you through how the labeling works in this simple example of just 5 nodes. So the first label is derived just as the hash of 1, the number 1. And then the next label will be derived as a hash of, well, its input index 2, but also any labels that it depends on, meaning that labels that belong to nodes which are direct parents of this particular node. So in this case, it's C1. So C2 would be the hash of both 2 and the label on node 1. And so on and so forth. 3 would hash in 3, but also the labels C1 and C2. And C4 would hash in 4, and then C3 and C1, its parents. And 5 would hash in 5, and then C4 and C1. And so what you kind of get is this dependency of labels down the road on previous labels. So it forces you to kind of do this sequential work in order to derive the labeling. And that will be important for why these things actually end up being secure. And in other words, why when you delete some or forget some of the labels, you will forcibly have to do a lot of sequential work in order to rederive them. So how do you use this labeling inside the proof of space framework we developed before? Well, I'm storing a gigabyte. You send a commitment to the graph labels that you've derived, and then you basically get a challenge set chosen from the labels. You open the labels of the nodes in the challenge set and their parents, and then the verifier checks that all these hash relationships between the labels on nodes in S and their parents were correctly derived. So another main tool that we will use is something called a depth-robust graph. So a depth-robust graph is a graph, a directed acyclic graph on n nodes, but it has a special property. And the special property is that any node, I'm picking sort of an arbitrary number here just to illustrate it. There's sort of more general ways of defining them, but I'm going to say that a depth-robust graph is a graph where if you delete or look at a subset of 80% of the graph, so you delete only, say, 20% of the graph and you keep the 80%, then the remaining 80% of nodes contains a long path. And what do I mean by long? I mean basically, proportional to n, right? So at least 1 minus delta times n. It's going to contain a long path. And in illustration, basically, I said I delete 20%, and the remaining number of nodes contain a long path, which are basically linear in the number of remaining nodes. And you can visually look at it like this. If I were to delete, say, the nodes in here, C4, C3 and C6, then sort of the other nodes still contain a long path of edges. And the reason this is going to be useful is because if you have to recompute the labels along a path, it requires sort of sequential work. So the next, So the building block for sort of the type proof of space that we're going to develop in the next few slides is basically a proof of space that's just based on this idea of a depth-robust graph alone. And this was actually something that it was joint work with Joe Bonneau, and I presented it last year at BPACE 2018, and we were using it for a proof of replication. And there, you basically you're just labeling a depth-robust graph. And why does this immediately give you some kind of proof of space? Well, if the prover deletes 80% of the labels, right, then it will have to do a large, since the 80% of the labels it deleted contains a long path, it'll have to do a lot of sequential hashing in order to rederive those labels if challenged. If challenged to produce those labels in an online challenge phase, okay? But this isn't a very tight proof of space because it basically allows the prover to delete 80% of the data. So we're going to try to do something better. So the next tool that we're going to use is something called a bipartite expander graph. An alpha-beta bipartite expander graph, it has two sets, what we call the sources and the sinks. And the node set A of sinks and the node set B of sources, there's edges from B to A, directed edges, and any alpha fraction of A is connected to at least a beta fraction of B, okay? And we call these expander graphs when B is noticeably larger than A, meaning that if you look at the total number of nodes that are connected to this beta is noticeably bigger than alpha. So there's an expansion factor of beta over alpha if there's beta nodes in B that are connected to any alpha nodes in A. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of combine these two different graph tools together. We're going to stack depth-robust graphs where in every layer of n nodes, there you put the edges of a depth-robust graph that satisfy this kind of minimal condition of being, depth-robust if you look at an 80% subset of the nodes, and then use bipartite expander edges to kind of connect the layers, and then finally we apply the method I described earlier of labeling a graph to derive labels on the final layer, and we only store the labels on the last level. as the proof of space storage. So let me try to give you some intuition of why this achieves a tighter security than just the depth robust graph. Well, if I were to delete, let's say, some fraction of the labels on the last level, okay, then maybe it wouldn't take me a long, if that was the only level that I had, then it wouldn't take me that long to rederive them because it's just a small fraction of the labels, and I have all the other labels which they depend on. But now, if I delete these, in order to rederive them, I actually needed labels on the previous level too, which I, in this example here, I have not actually stored. And the dependencies keep on expanding and blowing up with every level because we're using this expander graph. And so finally, on the first level, where we have the edges of a depth robust graph, you basically have to rederive almost all the nodes. And since deriving almost all the nodes requires a lot of sequential work due to the depth robustness property, you have basically a proof of space. Now, of course, when we want to prove that this is a proof of space, we can't assume that the adversary is only storing nodes, labels on the last level. We could allow it to store labels sprinkled throughout the layers, but we're able to prove that if the total storage that the adversary is using is, just less than 1 minus epsilon n, then we'll be able to find some blow up of dependencies on the things that he's missing. Okay? And so how do we kind of use this now just to build a generic proof of replication? Well, you take the labels on the last level and you just use it as basically a one-time sort of encryption pad, and you XOR it with your movie data file, and then you get an encoded movie data file. But extraction in this kind of very generic construction of a proof of replication is inefficient. It requires you to rederive the deterministic labels on the last level in order to decode your movie. So how could we maybe build something which has efficient data extraction? Given the caveats I said before about composability, we still may be interested in doing this. So we're going to start with kind of the same construction, but tweak it a bit. We're going to kind of absorb the expander edges between the levels, okay, into the layers, so that between the layers there's only just one edge between nodes. A node in a given layer does not have a direct dependency on many nodes in the previous layer. It just has an edge from the node at the same index in the prior level. And the edges or dependencies that were there before are kind of absorbed into extra dependencies within the same level. And then we reverse the direction of the edges on every level. And I'll explain in a moment the intuition for why we're doing that. But first, how this works is so the dashed edges basically correspond to or indicate where you would XOR the prior level label with a key derived from the parents on the next level. So for an example, C6, the label C6 would be C1 XOR the hash ID of these labels C7, C8, and C9. And now, basically by XORing, if we start with the data on the first level, we're basically deriving some kind of encoding of the labels so that each label encodes the same index label on the previous level. And then the final level of nodes, the final level contains sort of an encoding of the data inputs. And the data can be extracted efficiently by reversing this process. And when we reverse this process, it can be completely parallelized, and so it's much faster. So why do we still have this property of a proof of space? Well, if you look at, say, let's say we do the same thing, we forget one of the labels. Now, let's consider both its targets in this level and also its dependencies. If we move to the level right before, the targets of this node sort of become the dependencies of the node on the previous level. So in order to rederive this label C14, we needed still to have the label C9 because C14 encodes C9. It's the XOR of C9. But in order to rederive C9, we need C10, which was, part of the target set of C14 in the last level. So the targets become dependencies of the nodes we need to rederive on the previous level, and the dependencies become targets. And they keep on switching, and the dependencies end up growing. Why? Because the way that we chose these edges that we absorbed into the levels came from this expander graph construction, and the expander graph construction has this expansion property, which now applies to the size of the targets plus the dependencies. So the size of the targets plus dependencies of any deleted set of labels kind of inherits this expansion property. So that's sort of very high-level intuition, but the whole kind of analysis is in the paper, which is online, and there's a lot more sort of details to think through in proving security. So in summary, what you end up with is kind of log. You need log of 1 over epsilon total number of levels, but the node degree in each level is just based on this 80% depth robust graph. It's independent of epsilon. You don't need to increase the number of edges in each level when you change the parameter of the tightness of the proof of space. You only need to increase the number of levels proportional to log of 1 over epsilon. So what you end up with is a proof size of d over epsilon times log of 1 over epsilon. Now, there's actually a further optimization, because I promised initially that we just get the ideal increase in proof size of 1 over epsilon, not 1 over epsilon times log 1 over epsilon. And the further optimization is you basically taper the number of challenges or labels that you need to open in each level as you go up higher in the graph. And I won't go into the details of why that's still okay, but you end up even removing from the proof size the factor log of 1 over epsilon. You just have something which is a constant times the degree over epsilon. So in conclusion, we have constructed basically the first provably tight and proof of space with practical parameters, which is necessary for proof of replication. There's lots of details and performance optimizations left out and room for improvement. In fact, I've been working with the Filecoin folks all year, and they've implemented this construction as the basis of the Filecoin mining protocol, and we've been taking this construction and sort of trying to optimize its performance and make the proof sizes as small as possible. And it turns out that this even benefits from the accumulators that other work that Benedict and I and Dan did, that Benedict talked about yesterday, which are useful for making these proofs even smaller. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. I guess we can take 1 or 2 questions before the lightning talks.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. I have 2 questions. So T is very finicky. I'm very curious to know what research you've done to establish a very clearly weighted T.
The time T.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the time T actually isn't that finicky. The time T is we know what the time T is based on the parameters of the construction. Will be provably sort of linear in the number of nodes, in the graph. So it is possible to tune T further by basically adding making the hash function slower. In fact, one thing that we can do is use a verifiable delay function, or just an asymmetric an asymmetric function that's slow in one direction and fast in the other, so that we don't compromise on the efficiency of data extraction, but we can slow down T even further. But basically, the number of sequential hashes that you need to do if you delete some of the data, we can bound that, and that's going to be basically proportional to the number of nodes in the graph.
Well, to complete that question, my concern was more from a security perspective. How is that to prevent a manipulation of T to forge a proof? I mean, how did you? I mean, we're talking space.
Yeah.
So
So
I'm curious.
there isn't manipulation of T. What we do is, so basically we say that in order to, what we would say is the concrete security of this proof of space construction is that if the adversary deletes 1% of the data, then they'll have to do at least they'll have to compute, let's say, at least something which is order of n hashes in order to rederive the data, and actually has to compute them sequentially. So basically what you get is a minimum time that the adversary would need to spend in order to pass the protocol if they deleted too much data.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Next question. So when you say space, if we imagine a long distance of thinly distributed matter versus a small, very condensed matter, can you define space in proof of space a little more accurately? I mean, I haven't read the paper. I'm sure I don't know if there's
Right. So space
touched on.
is defined sort of in the computer science notion, or at least the theoretical notion. It just refers to the total number of basically of bytes of data that you're storing.
Okay, so it's very simple.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I had a point about error correcting codes.
Okay.
The expander graph construction and the zigzag graph construction reminds me of the LDPC and turbo codes. Where in an error correcting code, you want that if one block is missing, like an erasure, or is just in error, a lot of dependencies break.
Yep.
So that evolution from expander to the zigzag is very similar. It seems very similar to a turbo code, where you have one pass and then you interleave and have a backward pass, and this creates, their optimum.
Yes. Yeah. Expander graphs are used to build error correcting codes. In fact, so that's a good observation.
Okay, so it's in parallel. Another question about the interactive proof.
Yes.
Whether it's susceptible to DDoS, or if my connection in the context of Filecoin or in a blockchain, if the prover or the connection between the verifier and prover gets DDoSed, because it relies on a time bound for you to respond.
Right. Yeah.
Would that be a problem?
Yeah, that's a very good point. In an interactive version of this protocol, you would have to consider that somebody trying to sabotage the prover by preventing them from responding quickly. It also is one reason to consider trying to make the protocol as non-interactive as possible, and even the online phase you can try to make non-interactive by deriving the challenges according to basically a random beacon instead of sort of a non-interactive random beacon, which people are building using things called verifiable delay functions or other techniques or distributed randomness generation. And so making the proof of space as non-interactive as possible would be good for that reason. And in fact, Filecoin is pursuing that direction.
Great, so let's thank Ben again. And,